I want to show you, take it a little bit into the Trump campaign here, the end of the Trump campaign into the administration. So we've got Manafort is ousted in August of 2016. And then in the same month, Bannon is then made the Trump campaign chairman. I believe that was the name that he got. And so is Kellyanne Conway. She joins the campaign. And this was done at Rebecca Mercer's insistence. But Rebecca Mercer shows up at a Hamptons party. She finds Donald Trump. She says to him, listen, my team of Bannon and Conway are going to get you over the edge. And he's sort of out of luck because Manafort's gone. So he says yes, or maybe he's forced to agree, and they join the campaign. They land up winning, as we now know. And soon afterwards, Bannon gets the job of chief strategist and senior counselor. Not really a job that's existed before, but a job that they decided to give him nevertheless. And it was a senior enough job. He was in all the inside important conversations, although he was not in the room when it came to the National Security Council until they made an exception for him then as well. They said, let's add the chief strategist and senior counselor to the National Security Council. And that's when he joined that. But it certainly irked the Kushners a lot. Jared and Ivanka behind the scenes were known to be saying a lot of negative things around Bannon, and he in turn said a lot of negative things about them. But there was a bit of a turf war. And ultimately, as history has taught us, they won. Kushner and Ivanka won, and Bannon was ousted in the sort of, unceremonious sort of duel that ended in August of 2017. He was basically with Trump for just a year. What do you make of the internal dynamics between these characters? I mean, certainly Bannon versus the family, you take the family side almost all the time, but it sort of also ruined the coalition that elected Trump because it split that apart.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the fun things about investigating these guys is that they're all horrible. So because they're also all horrible, they also all hate each other.
Right.
And so it becomes a sort of a weird game of people who are actively working against each other, actively working with each other to do horrible things.
Right. Must have been a nightmare if you think about it.
Yeah, and my understanding is that Stone and Bannon are also pretty detesting of each other. And that might be untrue. I don't know either of them, so I can't speak.
It's true. We just never know what's theater and what's real. And
that's a good point. I grew up in New York, and I knew somebody who's was married to somebody who's very close to Roger Stone. And they used to run these games where they would have public fights, pretend to have falling outs, actually have screaming matches on the phone, but all the while knowing that they were not really, that they were going to come back and have a thing. So I am very suspicious about anything that comes from Roger Stone or relating to him, especially when he's having a fight with an old friend of his ever since that. Because, that predated the campaign. That was one of the first personal story I heard about him.
Yeah, no, it certainly rings true. They like the theater. They like the drama of it all. And that's how they get the attention. Craig, any thoughts about the internal dynamics of that White House?
There will always be turf battles and palace intrigue and all of that stuff. I think what scares me the most is I think we're at a very, very dangerous time. And there's so much going on in state legislatures and each of the voter suppression campaigns by them, all that kind of stuff. It's very scary because I think it looks like the Republicans may take both houses in next year. And Biden's poll numbers have been dropping. So that's what scares me a lot.
Yeah.
And there are always so many mechanisms in our own country, and the Russians know this, but they are anti-democratic. The way the Senate works, the gerrymandering, the voter suppression, all that is going on at a level that's very hard for the Democrats to stop because they don't have local power in 35 states.
And they refuse to get rid of the filibuster. Even they may not be a way to get rid of the filibuster, but they also refuse to try, I think. It certainly doesn't look like the Democrats are going to put up enough of a fight to reverse the state rules. It looks like they're sort of giving up on that, which does set up a victory for the Republicans next year. I mean, it's hard to imagine with all the gerrymandering going on and these voter suppression laws that the Republicans won't sweep at least the houses next year. And the state
legislatures. And proving each individual case is from a reporter's point of view means really getting into the weeds. And people really, I wrote voter suppression stories about the 2004 campaign in Ohio, where there's really a lot of evidence that the Republicans stole Ohio, which was a whole election. No one is interested in that. I mean, it's very hard. I mean, they better get interested now.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we were talking about yesterday when we had a wonderful conversation with Rachel Bittekoffer on messaging and how we got to get better at it. We can't hit them on the head with a long form report on voter suppression, but we can let them know that their democracy is on the line, and do they want to have a democracy anymore? So I think that's something that we're definitely going to be continuing
I certainly
to
wonder what people imagine happens when there's no democracy. I mean, I don't think people really understand the complexity and the awfulness of it. It's not just you don't get to vote. Every bit of your freedoms gets stripped away over time. Certainly your ability to speak out in any way and anything controversial in terms of, the choices you make in life, but also the ability to have a meritocracy disappears. You no longer are competing just with people based on your ability, which let's say you could do in America now, but you're competing against people who just know how to suck up basically to the powers that be, because that's where all the power is derived from, the one person, the leader. It's terrifying when you think of that for a country which has been built on exactly the opposite for so long.
My very first mentor in the resistance was a guy who had grown up in Romania. And he said that it starts with the silencing of truth. When you know that you can no longer speak out loud and you have to whisper your thoughts. And we saw that happening. Trump came in and on the rise made the press the enemy of the people. It was just a classic move.
Yeah, I grew up in South Africa where, the amount of fear you just had at the back of your mind, no matter what you did, it just lived with you. It was just there all the time because, you don't know all the time if you're going to make the wrong move, but say, the rules are so strict over there, even in terms of where you could sit or which buses you could take or how you could travel or who you could speak to. That constant fear is something that is hard to describe for people. And we're heading into a world in America that is going to be a lot like that. Limit our speech. They'll tell you what you can't speak about. They'll tell you what you can't teach your kids. They'll restrict where you can move. There's all these things that start showing up, and it's frightening. It's like a vice grip on your head. It really does limit what you're able to think of, and you think of opportunities you might have in the future. It really is incredibly limiting for people. So I don't know how we communicate that to America.
I think you just did.
Some of it, yes. But we should be doing more of that. I wish we could all teletransport back to like the apartheid South Africa and show people what it's like. It's not fun, It's not fun for anybody. I don't think it's fun for the people who are doing the oppressing, nor is it fun for the people who are being oppressed. And it's certainly not what America's about.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that I want to say I fully agree. I mean, doing the QAnon show, I think the most disturbing thing that we saw was how little regard young people that we were interacting with or talking to or just hearing about had for democracy as a concept.
Yeah.
And how broad that was. And I think the hour is a lot later than anybody realizes.
That's right.
Yeah.
The level, so many people believe things that are demonstrably false. It is just astonishing. And it is as if nearly a third of the country or whatever is insane. They are not connected to real life events. They don't share what we do. And I've never seen that before. It spills over into COVID, of course, where not getting a vaccine is considered a badge of honor among Republicans. They are willing to give their lives, to risk their lives, and in many cases give their lives to make a political point that, what is this going on?
It's crazy. People are dying.
It may be a stretch a bit, but if you go back to the Confederacy, there you had poor young white men who were cannon fodder giving their lives to enslave black people. I mean, it's just sort of astonishing how parts of this country have been nuts.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in South Africa, there was anything that you did politically, if you had a political conversation with a group of more than two people, was considered an illegal political gathering and you could be arrested for. That's three people. I mean, that could be dinner, that could be anything. That would be considered, if you were overheard at dinner discussing something that was opposed to the South African government of the time, you would be committing a crime and you could be thrown in jail. I mean, the consequences from that would be endless, of course. So it's not impossible to imagine this crowd who came up with that abortion law and who came up with all these other crazy laws for coming up with things that are that restrictive going forward in America. And it's hard for people to imagine what it's like, but it's not fun. And it's certainly not fun being the pariah of the world, which is where America will be in an event like that. I mean, if we keep going down this road into fascism, it's not like we'll be celebrated in the world the way we are now. We'll be looked at as pariahs.
Yeah, I also think there's an important thing within this of even our notion of rights are getting, I think, intentionally muddied. In the sense of where somebody telling you to shut up does not impugn your First Amendment rights. Right. Your First Amendment right is a contract with the government that they're not going to throw you in jail. Right. And so the notion of you by saying you don't like me anymore when I do this, or even the notion of cancel. Like cancel culture, in my opinion, or that notion of it is much more to do with the fact that an employer can now fire you for anything, more than it is what people are saying on Twitter.
Right.
That
right.
People are actually, those who lost their job, well, talk to the company.
Yeah.
But blaming it on this sort of on culture and these things that are real. Like I think that you wouldn't see vaccine skepticism as high as it is if it weren't for OxyContin.
Right. It's a good point.
Yes, right.
Good point.
In no way does that
And
sort of
Facebook.
justify it or say it's okay, but it leaves an opening for that criticism, that it rings true for people for that reason. And so we also have to address these underlying issues that allow this disinformation to come out.
Can I just say one more thing
go
on
ahead.
Deripaska, since we're decloaking him? I'm a mom. I always have sympathy, and I always try to send light to people, and Deripaska is from the Guinness Book of World Records, most polluted town in the world. And I find that just interesting to know that he's from a town that has, more pollution than any other town because it was essentially a, chemical weapons manufacturing town. And then he got out, and I guess he studied physics. I guess he had a mom who encouraged him to learn, and he got out. I'm assuming that's a profile of a guy who never wants to go back to that and will do anything that he can, including sucking up publicly on camera to Putin, who called him basically a cockroach in that video.
He did,
and
right?
so I just think that, there's just something to be cognizant of there when we're looking at these people who are very rich and they are very scary. They don't want to go back to what they came from, and they're sort of forcing us into that dystopian world. And
we cut you off, Heidi, if I can, if that's okay. I just want to bring in Glenn Kirshner, who's just joining us for a few minutes here towards the end of the show. Hi, Glenn. How are you? It's good to see you again.
Hey, Zev. Hey, everybody. How are we all doing?
Good. Craig Unger's here. Jack Bryan is here, and Heidi Kuda, who you've never met, I don't think, up until now, but you got a chance to with all this brilliant brain trust we have tonight. I'm glad you could join us. I wanted to really talk to you about this Bannon thing. I am still kind of two minds, whether it should be going to the DOJ or whether it should be something that they decide within their committee and within the Congress that they arrest him and put him behind bars with inherent contempt, or whether they should do. Is the DOJ is not giving me a lot of confidence on a lot of things these days? Should I feel confident about the fact that they're going to be adjudicating Bannon?
I am cautiously optimistic. So I actually think, Zev, they should be pursuing both vehicles to enforce their subpoenas. When you refer somebody for criminal contempt, I'll talk about that in a minute, to the Department of Justice for prosecution, what you're trying to do is punish the wrongdoer for being in contempt of Congress.
Right.
When you're using your inherent power of contempt, which the Supreme Court has repeatedly said is a lawful vehicle for Congress to enforce its subpoenas. Now, the Supreme Court hasn't said it since the 1930s because that's when Congress last used it, but it remains a lawful vehicle for Congress to enforce its own subpoenas. That is to try to get the testimony, the documents, the information Congress needs in furtherance of its investigation. I see no reason why Congress can't be doing both. But let's talk about what they've chosen for a moment. They've chosen a criminal referral to the Department of Justice. I have every reason to believe that the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Channing Phillips, whom I served with for decades in that office, will do precisely what the federal law requires him to do. The federal law says once a criminal contempt referral has been made by Congress, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia shall, not might, not may, shall present the matter to the grand jury for its action. What does the action look like? Well, the action looks like a criminal contempt of Congress charge because Steve Bannon inarguably committed the crime of criminal contempt of Congress. There is no executive privilege. Donald Trump, according to the Select Committee's own report, hasn't even tried to invoke executive privilege to protect Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon has no factual defense and he has no legal defense. I expect the grand jury in the District of Columbia will indict him. It will then move over to the courts. And the good news about a criminal prosecution, unlike civil litigation, which we know Donald Trump, Don McGahn, and others will weaponize the delay inherent in the civil litigation system endlessly to run out the clock to their own nefarious ends. In a criminal case, you can't really do that. If you have a prosecutor determined to prosecute the case in a timely manner, and you have a judge who refuses to cater to a litigant that wants a delay at every turn, the federal law, the Speedy Trial Act, says prosecutors shall go from indictment to trial in 70 days. Now, that's only sort of observed in the breach, and the parties typically want to push federal trials well beyond 70 days, but we don't have to. So I think the signs are good that Steve Bannon will be successfully criminally prosecuted. To what end? Well, he'll use it as a fundraising vehicle, right? He'll go from the We Build a Wall Foundation, which he used to steal money from Donald Trump's supporters, for which he was pardoned by Donald Trump. And then he'll go to the, We're Held in Contempt Foundation, and he'll use that as a fundraising vehicle. So, but I still think this is an important and necessary step for Congress to do everything it can to ensure Steve Bannon is criminally prosecuted.
It's certainly important just to have the power back. I mean, certainly it doesn't feel like the House has had its powers for the last few years. So it's nice to see them executing some sort of attempt to get them back. I'm a little concerned, the clock is not very long. And by the time we get to next November, the Republicans could be in charge of the House. And, if Bannon is able to run the clock out a few times, and we might not get to a fully formed conclusion out of this commission, which is really important to find out what happened on January 6th.
That's a great point, Zev. And that is what militates in favor of Congress using its own lawful power of inherent contempt. Because how will we feel if we look back from the end of our democracy and realize that Congress has never deployed its lawful power of contempt to actually make progress in the insurrection investigation? How are we going to feel about that if Congress has never done everything it could to save our democracy? I'm thinking we're not going to feel too good about that.
I'm going to feel like I feel about the filibuster. We're looking for extraordinary measures to be implemented these times, and we're not really seeing them done yet. Not in any of these attempts to pass the voting bill, or here it would be good to see the Democrats being a little bit more strident in their attempts here, but who knows if there's some bigger strategy involved. Does anybody on the panel want to ask Glenn any questions? Craig or Jack, do you have any?
Yeah, I just one question for Glenn. You were pretty convincing about the prosecutor being on the case, but what about the judge? Do we know it won't go to a judge who was appointed by Trump?
Let's hope it doesn't go to somebody like Trevor McFadden, who was appointed by Trump and has really embarrassed himself in the way he has let Donald Trump get away with weaponizing the delay in the system. But on the flip side, Craig, look at who just assumed responsibility, what judge assumed responsibility for the Donald Trump, bogus executive privilege lawsuit that was just filed. Judge Tanya Chutkan, who, I hate to sound like a name dropper, I used to try murder cases against Tanya Chutkan when she was a public defender in the local courts of Washington, D.C. decades ago. She is strong, fair, fierce, fearless, and she will put up with exactly zero Donald Trump nonsense. But it's a great question, Craig, because when and if Steve Bannon is indicted, hopefully that will be imminent. Let's hope we get a good judge assignment.
Right.
Yeah, I have a question, actually. Let's say we're living in the universe where everything works out, everybody who should go to jail does, and justice prevails. What is the sign that you would like to see to indicate that that's the world we're living in?
So I think the first necessary step, if we're ever going to hope to, even minimally approach justice, is criminally indicting Donald Trump for the many crimes he inarguably committed against the United States and against the American people. The problem is he has committed, and if we had an hour and a half, Zev and I have had this conversation, I could catalog all Donald Trump's crimes, starting with, if you only wanted to go back to 2016, the criminal conspiracy he was in with Michael Cohen to commit campaign finance violations to, basically rob the voters of the full value of their vote. He was never prosecuted for that. That case would be like shooting fish in a barrel, because you've got a co-conspirator for whom, he committed the crime for and at the direction of Donald Trump. that, give me 3 hours in front of a jury and I'll prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. And then, whether it's extortion and bribery of President Zelensky, whether it's obstruction of Congress by telling all of his executive branch officials do not comply with lawfully issued congressional subpoenas, whether it's witness tampering of Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch in real time while she's testifying before Congress, whether it is, countless avoidable COVID deaths. Maybe we will go the way of Brazil, the Senate report that just came out on President Bolsonaro. And how about inciting an insurrection, right? The criminal cherry on the treason cake, over and over.
There's a Mueller report at 10.
And here's the problem. If the Department of Justice does not prosecute crimes that we all know Donald Trump committed, it will be a political calculation. And today's Department of Justice will be no better than the Bill Barr, Donald Trump Department of Justice, because everything it did was a political calculation to benefit Donald Trump's criminal associates and penalize his perceived enemies. So it has to start with an indictment. I maintain Donald Trump is a federal problem and we need a federal solution. That looks like a federal indictment. But you know what? If Georgia wants to be the first one out of the, the starters blocks with a criminal indictment, God bless them. New York wants to be the first one out of the gate with a criminal indictment, God bless them. I predict when one jurisdiction indicts Donald Trump, and one jurisdiction will, everybody's going to want to be the second jurisdiction to indict Donald Trump, because nobody wants to take the maiden legal voyage. Today, when I saw the report issued about President Bolsonaro, I mourn the fact that I'm no longer the chief of homicide at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, because I would have been in the grand jury presenting all of the evidence supporting criminal charges for avoidable COVID deaths, not only by Donald Trump, but by Mike Pence as the head of the COVID task force, and Jared Kushner for that obscenity, that criminal obscenity, by saying, let's let it run rampant through the blue states. I mean, this is criminal conduct.
For sure. And they profited off of it all the time. Any questions from the audience? Heidi, does anyone want to throw any question for Glenn or from you?
Gosh, Glenn just energized everybody. They're just so happy to hear what you have to say. There are two things. One is from me. Do you have a read on Deripaska and what this might mean for the overall Trump-Russia, investigations?
Boy, Heidi, I sure hope it's something other than, he's violating sanctions. How can this not go back to the Mueller investigation? How can it not? But, listen, we're all sitting here saying, how can Donald Trump not have been prosecuted yet? So I am anxiously awaiting the unsealing of an affidavit in support of the search warrant for Deripaska's properties to see what is this one about. Now, we shouldn't, get our hopes up that we're going to hear anything soon. Look at how long ago the FBI executed search warrants on Rudy Giuliani's house and office. They collected up his electronic devices. And here we are, how many months later, with no criminal charges for Rudy Giuliani? So
although the statute of limitations might be running out on some of the Deripaska stuff soon, so maybe there's some, maybe they're doing some of this just to make sure that they've got something beating the clock there. We started off the show thinking that this was at least a tip-off. The takedown of Trump Russia might be coming because, we saw Steele on Monday, Christopher Steele doing that interview with George Stephanopoulos. We saw also today the attorney for Washington, D.C., the AG, including Mark Zuckerberg in the lawsuit against Facebook. So there's, there seems to be a move, Bannon this week as well, to do some things around the people involved in Trump Russia. Do you think that there might be something in there? I mean, are we hoping against hope? You might have already answered it, but is there symbolic meaning that could be read out of all these events happening this week?
I think we're moving in the right direction, albeit far too slowly, because public safety is at risk. And every day Donald Trump is not arrested, is not held accountable, is another day that we, the people, suffer. But, and I always go back also to the fairly recent arrest of Tom Barrack, because that could be a treasure trove of criminal information about Donald Trump. I don't think Barrack, with his fancy suits, is the kind of guy who's going to thrive in federal prison. So I have a feeling it's good news that we've heard nothing out of that case up in the Eastern District of New York. U.S. Attorney's Office. Boy, because if Barrack is cooperating, you only need a couple of charges against Donald Trump. You can only confine a man for but one life. So let's get off the dime. Let's charge him somewhere.
Yeah. What happens if Donald Trump is actually thrown in jail? Does he get Secret Service protection? I'm asking only facetiously. Like, does he lose all those privileges once he gets thrown in jail, or
Yeah,
does he
so
keep them?
The orange matches his hair, doesn't it? I think his skin.
Yeah. No, I kind of view him the way I view my long-term cooperators who, cooperate with our investigation, and then they have to serve long prison terms anyway. They go into the Bureau of Prisons Witness Protection Program. It's generally sponsored by the U.S. Marshal Service. So I suspect Donald Trump's security would be handed off to a combination of the Bureau of Prisons and the U.S. Marshal Service, and they would put him somewhere safe.
I'm enjoying that vision. I'm enjoying it. I like it a lot. Certainly, seeing him in a prison outfit would be a welcome thing for everybody who had to suffer through his election and his term as president. Glenn, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Is there any last words you wanted to share with our audience about your podcast and about your other terrific work that you do?
Yeah, the podcast every day is a new video with legal analysis du jour. It's Justice Matters with Glenn Kirshner on YouTube 7 days a week. We don't miss a day. And of course, you can find me on Twitter. It's Glenn Kirshner 2. I hope to be promoted to Glenn Kirshner 1 someday. But as of right now, I am Glenn Kirshner 2, and I think I will forever be. So
we support that promotion, though.
Legal questions as all day, all night on Twitter. So those are a couple of places you can find me.
It's definitely one of the best Twitter feeds out there. We welcome you to our show, and we hope you'll come back again. Glenn, thanks very much for being here tonight.
Great being with you, Zev. Good seeing everybody.
Likewise. Have a good night.
Thank you, Glenn.
You too.
Okay. Well, it was nice to have Glenn drop in there. He's so nice and refreshing. It always gives me a lot of hope, Thank God there's people like him who've worked in the public sector and continue to do the good work even once they're gone. So that was positive. I felt like there were some good takeaways from there, although it didn't seem like Donald Trump was going to get thrown in jail anytime soon, nor Bannon. But as we wrap up the show, I want to get some last thoughts from you guys about, are we heading into an election season that's even going to be even more frightening than 2016, that we haven't really seen any of the things fixed or repaired that brought us 2016? Are you anticipating an election season next year and into 24 that is going to be any better?
Yeah, so the way that I always look at elections at this point is that whatever it is that will determine the next election has not happened yet. So things are going to happen. A lot of things are going to happen that haven't happened yet, and they're all going to be determinative. But they haven't happened yet. So I think that right now the focus should be on fixing our institutions, on attempting to really deal with getting ourselves out of the trouble that we're in, and focus a little bit less for now on the election, just because I think that, who knows, it's jump ball, but there are real serious problems that we have in front of us that we do know about and that we can solve, and that solving those things will actually help us get to the election. And if we do those things, that actually might be the answer of what determined the election, and so it depends on what people do between now and then. Yeah,
it seems like the time is now, right? There's no time to be messing around. It's time to jump in and do whatever we need to do. Craig?
Yeah, I'm pretty pessimistic, and I'm pessimistic about next year's elections just because of voter suppression and the gerrymandering and all that kind of stuff that's been out there. But there was an interesting piece in the Washington Spectator the other day by Jonathan Weiner, and it took apart some of the memos regarding January 6th and analyzed them really as blueprints for everything that can go wrong and will go wrong and will be used again in 2024. And that is what is really disturbing. And there are ways of trying to disallow the votes in various states so that everything is thrown to the House of Representatives, and there Republicans will have a majority of state delegations. The Democrats now, of course, control the House in pure numbers, but there are more Republican delegations, and it's probably going to be worse 2 years hence.
It does look like they've built a framework that will allow them to hijack the elections in 24. I mean, it certainly, if everything succeeds the way they want it to succeed, they will win a majority of the state houses, and they'll win the House and maybe even the Senate next year, and then they'll be able to really rig the presidential in 24.
There's so many mechanisms that we have that are completely undemocratic. I mean, one of the most vivid examples to me was something like 86% of Americans are for background checks if you're buying weapons. But 10%, senators representing 10% of the entire population can block such a law.
Yeah,
it's just crazy the way things power is parceled out in the less populated Western states and so forth.
I think all the tricks we're seeing are the kind of tricks you see from a deadly dying party. So they're doing all these things because they don't have the numbers, and because Americans, young Americans in particular, who will have the power, are embracing of progressive values. So all these things that we're seeing, all this scary stuff, is because they are desperate. And we have seen time and time again in the history of this country that when we activate our base and when we dial in our messaging, as we just did here in California, when dark money Republicans tried to steal our perfectly adequate governor, we crushed it. Now, I know we're in California.
Yeah, but turnout matters. Turnout matters, and that's how they won.
It does. And particularly when you look at Russia and their chicanery, they noodle margins. They don't make it very obvious. So it's like mobilize the base with great messaging. And, if we have to, we're going to have to hit the streets, because I'm not naive at the amount of voter suppression that's going on. So, but
turnout. Those are a big deal.
Active.
Yeah. I'm going to leave you on a little bit because I don't want to leave this undone, this one slide that I want to share with you, because it does sort of lead into why I have some optimism. The coalition that gave us Trump, Russia, involved countries, involved nation states, but it also involved people. Involved Michael Flynn, who's still very much around, but he's driving off the deep end, it looks like, but nevertheless, still very much the one person who's out there actively involved. Bannon, who we know could be heading to jail soon, representing maybe China, people say. Prince, who was a representative of the UAE, or at least just the UAE, maybe more, and maybe Israel as well. And Jared Kushner was representative of Israel. I mean, all these players are sort of not engaged in the game anymore, and neither are the nation states that back them. I mean, they've all been taught their lessons, or at least have gotten adequate payoffs or warnings. Russia has got Nord Stream 2, so I believe that's going to make them happy enough to stay out of elections for a period of time. Beijing is having all sorts of economic problems, and the last thing they want is any more turbulence economically. The UAE has been told off by the Biden administration in no uncertain terms, and Bibi Netanyahu's gone from Israel. So maybe there's something in all of that to take some positive inspiration from, that, we're no longer have this weird coalition of friends and adversaries that are going to be targeting America as overtly as they have up until now. So that's at least might be one positive takeaway. And other than that, you're absolutely right, Heidi. Turnout and people getting involved, as you mentioned, Jack and Craig, this is a very important time for Americans. So hopefully people take it seriously. And hopefully we'll also see some people going to jail. From the start of the show, this is all about, is the takedown happening? Boy, it would be nice to have something actually show up in terms of the jail term for some of these leaders.
It's necessary.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts for anybody? Or are we going to say goodnight otherwise? Jack, why don't you tell everyone where they can find you?
So I've just started a company earlier this year called Bunker Crew Media. We have a podcast we're producing called Kremlin File. The hosts are Monique Kamara and Olga Lotman. It's great. It's a great show.
That's with the guys from Medea's Touch, right? Is that right? Or is that a different?
Oh, yeah, we're doing Midas Touch as well, yes. We're doing it with them. And then also we're basically, over the last 4 years, we've collected a lot of the craziest stories we've ever heard. So we're doing a series of mini-series podcasts that are sort of true crime with an espionage angle that all kind of relate to these operations that we're talking about today.
That's going to be really interesting. I think I might live one of those stories, so I'll share some with you in a different life.
Love to hear.
Craig, people can, of course, buy your book, American Kompromat, but where else can they find you?
Great.
Yeah, well, I'm sort of going in hiding. I'm in the early stages of starting a new book, and I'm not quite ready to talk about it, but I will be tweeting occasionally, and my Twitter handle is Craig Unger.
So no matter how much I ask, you're not going to tell me what it is. No, I'm not going to ask.
We'll be the first
It'll be rude.
to know.
It'll be rude
We'll be
to
the
ask
first
it.
to know.
I have a nice picture of your book. There's American Kompromat, the Craig Unger book. Pick it up. It's really an incredible book. It gives you all the dirt on why you can believe that Trump was a Russian asset all along, from the 1980s, right? I mean, all the way back to 1984, I think, is when you were able to find traces.
Exactly. In 1980, he bought all his television funds from an electronics shop that turned out to be a KGB front, and that's how it all started.
I love that story. It's so good, and everyone can read it in American Kompromat. Thank you both for being here tonight. We really appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll have you back on the show in the future. I'll be back on Friday night with LB and Greg Oliar for the Friday after show. And with that, it's good night from everyone here at Narrative. Have a good night, everybody. Narrative is made possible by viewers like you. Join today and support truly independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. That's patreon.com/narrative.